The autumn rain began its descent upon the isolated Blackwood estate, an imposing European-style fortress masked as a luxury retreat. Inside, wealth hummed a quiet, arrogant tune. Crystal chandeliers cast a cold, fractured light over the annual charity gala. Silk rustled against tailored wool as the region's elite gathered, perfectly insulated from the gathering storm. Eleanor Vance stood near the arched windows. A brilliant, ice-cold figure wrapped in emerald silk. She held a crystal flute, her posture rigid, calculating every unspoken variable. Beside her, Victor Thorne leaned in, his smile sharp and practiced. He murmured a quiet observation, his gaze directed down at the secondary parking lot below. In the pouring rain, a man stood beside an ancient, rust-eaten Land Rover Defender. Arthur Sterling, a solitary figure whose quiet resilience contrasted sharply with the ballroom's fragile vanity. The battered vehicle sat like an unwanted ghost among the sleek, polished sedans of the elite. Rain battered its heavy steel frame, washing away nothing of its rugged history. Arthur paid no attention to the watchful eyes above. He knelt on the wet gravel, carefully pulling the collar of a heavy wool coat around his young daughter, Lily. Eleanor watched the child's serious gray eyes meet her father's. For a singular, suspended moment, the rhythm of the ballroom faded, replaced by the weight of that quiet interaction. Victor let out a low, polished laugh, dismissing the scene as a trivial absurdity. The sound cut through Eleanor's focus, bringing the cold reality of the boardroom back. Without a glance upward, Arthur lifted the child into the cab. The heavy door shut with a solid thud, and the old Defender rolled away into the swallowing dark. As the evening waned, the polite chatter shifted to hushed murmurs. Victor stood with the board, discussing the company's bleeding financial veins behind crystal glasses and forced smiles. Eleanor navigated the treacherous social waters with icy precision. She offered nothing but unyielding confidence, masking the corporate decay they were all secretly anticipating. Beyond the heavy oak doors, the mountain weather deteriorated rapidly. The wind tore through the ancient pines, transforming the aristocratic estate into an isolated island amidst the deluge. Valets in drenched slickers struggled against the horizontal rain, bringing expensive, low-clearance sedans to the stone portico. The rising water levels went entirely unnoticed by the departing elite. In the grand foyer, Victor held out Eleanor's heavy cashmere coat. His expression was a carefully constructed mask of professional concern, hiding his true intentions. He suggested the Eastern Mountain Pass. A faster route, he claimed, essential for her to rest before the critical board vote scheduled for the following morning. Unwilling to show weakness, Eleanor accepted the subtle challenge. She declined a hired driver, tightening the belt of her coat with the sharp finality of a woman in total control. She settled into the low-slung leather seat of her luxury sports coupe. The dashboard illuminated like a sterile spaceship, a stark contrast to the chaotic forces gathering outside. Standing under the portico, Victor watched her taillights bleed into the fog. The practiced smile evaporated from his face, leaving only a cold, calculating stare. Eleanor's vehicle accelerated onto the winding, unlit mountain road. The sleek machine sliced through the darkness, blindly rushing toward a trap set by the unforgiving sky. The winding asphalt became a slick ribbon of danger. Eleanor pushed the sports coupe, her confidence clashing with the escalating fury of the storm. Without warning, the headlights illuminated a massive, splintered pine tree lying across both lanes. A solid wall of timber blocking the only path forward. Tires screamed against wet tarmac as she slammed the brakes. The sleek vehicle skidded, stopping mere inches from the jagged bark. She shifted into reverse, but the mountain had other plans. Behind her, the swollen creek crested its banks, sending a surge of muddy water across the road. In seconds, the low-clearance car was trapped in a rising, muddy lake. The turbulent current swallowed the wheels, dragging the vehicle deeper. The high-tech dashboard flashed a frantic series of crimson warnings before shorting out completely. The cabin plunged into a cold, absolute darkness. Miles away, Arthur navigated the treacherous terrain with practiced ease. The Defender's cabin glowed with the soft amber of a military-grade weather radar. The Coast Guard radio crackled to life, relaying a distress ping from the blocked eastern pass. His steely gaze locked onto the coordinates. With a calculated turn of the heavy steering wheel, Arthur redirected the rugged machine. He headed straight into the eye of the deluge. Back in the sports car, icy water began seeping through the door seals. Eleanor sat perfectly still, realizing her immense wealth held absolutely no currency here. The icy water rose relentlessly, swallowing the luxury leather floorboards and biting through Eleanor's tailored cashmere coat. She pushed against the heavy car door with all her strength, but the external water pressure had sealed it shut. It was a perfectly engineered steel vault. Further down the mountain, the old Defender tore through a flooded crossing. Arthur drove not with recklessness, but with the cold precision of a veteran. Mud and debris battered the heavy steel chassis, but the machine, and the man guiding it, remained entirely unfazed by the chaos. Inside the sinking coupe, Eleanor's breath clouded the freezing glass. Her emerald silk gown clung heavily to her skin, stained with muddy water. The turbulent current suddenly shifted the vehicle. The sports coupe scraped against the submerged asphalt, inching precariously toward the unseen edge of the road. She closed her eyes, maintaining her stoic facade even as the freezing water reached her waist. A quiet, dignified resignation settled over her. Then, a deep, rhythmic vibration hummed through the rushing water. A mechanical growl that steadily overpowered the howling wind. Two blinding yellow beams of light pierced the pitch-black fog, cutting through the torrential rain like an absolute force of authority. The rusted Land Rover emerged from the darkness like a heavily armored leviathan. The very vehicle the elite had scoffed at was now her only tether to life. Arthur stepped from the heavy cab into the raging floodwaters. The freezing current battered his legs, but his posture remained absolute and unyielding. Through the fogged, reinforced glass, Eleanor saw the face of her rescuer. It was the very man whose humble existence she had silently dismissed hours ago. He raised a hand, signaling for her to lean away from the door. There was no hesitation in his movement, only calculated intent. A sharp strike from a steel rescue tool shattered the driver's side window. The tempered glass exploded inward, instantly swallowed by the roaring storm. Freezing water poured into the ruined cabin. Arthur reached through the jagged opening, extending a weathered, steady hand toward the trapped executive. Eleanor grasped his arm. With a singular, powerful motion, he pulled her free from the sinking metal vault and out into the violent tempest. He guided her through the waist-deep, turbulent current. The unyielding force of the mountain flood was rendered powerless against his disciplined strength. Arthur lifted the freezing woman into the passenger side of the Defender. The heavy door closed, instantly muffling the deafening roar of the storm. Eleanor collapsed onto the worn fabric seat. Her emerald silk gown was destroyed, her aristocratic composure completely washed away by the sheer reality of survival. Without a word, Arthur returned to the driver's seat and engaged the heavy transmission. Behind them, the sleek sports coupe finally slipped beneath the dark water. The heavy Defender reversed away from the collapsing edge of the road. Its massive tires found traction in the mud where the engineered perfection of the sports car had completely failed. Inside the cabin, Arthur reached behind his seat and produced a thick, faded military blanket. He held it out to Eleanor without turning his head. She wrapped the coarse wool around her shivering shoulders. Her eyes drifted to his hands on the steering wheel, scarred, steady, and moving with absolute precision. The mounted radio crackled through the quiet cabin. A dispatcher requested a status update, to which Arthur responded with crisp, efficient military protocol. Eleanor absorbed the brief exchange. The sharp, calculating mind of the CEO struggled to reconcile this veteran commander with the humble mechanic from the parking lot. The rugged vehicle navigated a treacherous, debris-strewn incline. Fallen branches violently scraped the steel roof, yet the cabin remained an impenetrable fortress against the storm. In the dim amber glow of the dashboard, Eleanor's gaze caught a faded Coast Guard search and rescue patch stitched into the canvas ceiling. Arthur noticed her observation but offered no grand explanations. He simply reached down and adjusted the heavy climate vents, directing the maximum heat toward the passenger seat. The silence that settled between them was no longer filled with aristocratic disdain. It was the heavy, undeniable quiet of a life debt suddenly incurred. The Defender finally crested the mountain ridge, leaving the catastrophic floodwaters below. Through the thinning fog, the faint, industrial lights of an emergency shelter blinked in the distance. The heavy Defender rolled to a halt in the muddy courtyard of the mountain community center, its headlights illuminating a chaotic swarm of displaced locals. Arthur stepped into the deluge, instantly becoming the anchor in a sea of panic. Volunteers immediately gravitated toward his imposing, calm presence. Eleanor descended from the high cabin into the freezing mud. Her ruined designer heels sank into the earth, stripping away the last remnants of her elite armor. Inside, the shelter was a dim cavern lit by flickering generator lights. The air was thick with the quiet desperation of those who had fled the storm. A small figure broke through the crowd of huddled survivors. Lily's serious gray eyes locked onto her father with absolute, unspoken relief. Arthur dropped to one knee, wrapping his strong arms around the young girl. It was a fleeting, profoundly guarded moment of paternal vulnerability. Standing silently near the entrance, Eleanor observed the embrace. Surrounded by strangers, the wealthy executive had never felt more entirely out of place. An exhausted volunteer approached Arthur with a sodden clipboard, instinctively yielding the burden of leadership to the former commander. Without hesitation, Arthur began analyzing the structural blueprints of the remaining mountain passes, his authority absolute and unquestioned by the locals. A weary woman handed Eleanor a simple styrofoam cup of hot coffee. The CEO accepted it with trembling, mud-stained hands, staring blankly into the dark liquid. From her isolated corner, Eleanor watched Arthur orchestrate the shelter's logistics. The chaotic noise of the room faded against his disciplined coordination. Outside in the relentless downpour, he loaded heavy supply crates into the Defender. His stamina appeared entirely endless, fueled by an ingrained sense of duty. Back inside, Lily quietly approached the exhausted executive. The young girl carried a small, neatly folded dry towel. Mirroring her father's stoic nature, Lily placed the towel on the empty chair beside Eleanor without uttering a single word. Eleanor registered the silent gesture. Slowly, she used the coarse fabric to wipe the thick, freezing mud from her trembling fingers. Returning from the courtyard, Arthur immediately stepped into the breach. Bracing his boots against the wet floor, he forced the heavy oak doors shut against the gale. He threw the heavy iron deadbolt into place, turning to the frightened crowd with a single, calm nod. The rising panic was instantly extinguished. Eleanor absorbed this raw display of psychological control. The corporate manipulation she wielded every day felt utterly fragile compared to this absolute competence. As the agonizing hours dragged on, Eleanor rested her head against the cold cinderblock wall. Beyond the barricaded doors, the violent storm finally began its slow retreat. Pale morning light breached the high windows of the shelter. The violent tempest had finally broken, leaving behind a cold, fractured landscape of mud and debris. Eleanor opened her eyes to the quiet hum of the surviving crowd. She sat up slowly, the heavy military blanket still draped across her shoulders. Through the open doorway, she observed Arthur standing by his mud-caked vehicle. He was already coordinating with local authorities, entirely untired by the brutal night. Eleanor retrieved her phone from a portable generator station. The cracked screen illuminated instantly, flooded with dozens of urgent, missed communications. A stark message from her assistant flashed on the glass. Victor had called an emergency board session for 10 o'clock to initiate a hostile suspension. The digital clock read 8:45. The humbling vulnerability of the storm evaporated instantly, replaced by the icy, calculating resolve of a cornered executive. She stood, shedding the blanket but retaining the oversized field jacket over her ruined silk gown. The visual contrast was jarring, yet radiated a dangerous new authority. Eleanor stepped out into the biting morning air. Arthur paused his conversation, his steely gaze registering the profound shift in her demeanor. There were no pleasantries or requests, only a silent, mutual understanding. She needed transport to the city, and he simply opened the passenger door. The battered Defender rolled down the devastated mountain roads toward the distant, gleaming skyline. The war of nature had ended, but a much colder conflict was about to begin. At 9:30, the mud-encased Defender pulled up to the pristine glass facade of Vance Global. The rugged machine was a glaring anomaly against the sterile corporate architecture. Eleanor stepped onto the immaculate pavement. There was no dramatic farewell, only a brief, resolute nod exchanged between two warriors of different battlefields. Arthur watched her approach the revolving glass doors, his stoic expression betraying nothing before he shifted the heavy gears and drove back toward the mountains. Inside the gleaming marble lobby, polished executives halted in their tracks. They stared openly at her ruined silk gown, bare, mud-stained legs, and the oversized military jacket. She paid their silent judgments absolutely no mind. Her posture remained flawless, her face an unreadable mask of ice as she stepped into the private executive elevator. The brass doors parted on the top floor. Hannah, her meticulous executive assistant, was waiting anxiously near a secondary conference room. Hannah ushered the CEO inside, locking the glass door behind them. Resting on the polished mahogany table was a thick, heavily tabbed leather folder. Opening the file, the assistant revealed 6 months of secretly compiled financial forensics, forged invoices and offshore wire transfers, all bearing Victor's digital signature. Eleanor processed the damning documents in silence. The ultimate betrayal was confirmed, but the mechanism for his complete professional destruction was now firmly in her grasp. She closed the heavy folder with a sharp, resonant snap. It was 5 minutes to 10. Without altering her ruined attire, she turned toward the main boardroom. Inside the expansive, glass-walled boardroom, Victor Thorne stood at the head of the long table, flawlessly dressed and commanding the room's attention. He wove a smooth, calculated narrative, framing Eleanor's disappearance during the storm as a reckless abandonment of her executive responsibilities. The senior board members nodded in grave agreement, entirely captivated by his fabricated concern for the corporation's fragile future. With a subtle, practiced smile, Victor formally motioned for her immediate, indefinite administrative suspension. His victory seemed absolute. At that precise second, the heavy double doors at the far end of the boardroom swung open without a knock. Eleanor entered. The jarring sight of her mud-stained skin, ruined silk, and faded military canvas instantly paralyzed the room in stunned silence. Victor's confident smile froze, fracturing into thinly veiled panic as his meticulously crafted narrative collided with her physical survival. She did not shout or offer frantic explanations. She simply walked the length of the room, bringing the smell of rain and cold earth into the sterile tower. Reaching the head of the table, Eleanor dropped the heavy red leather folder onto the polished glass. The heavy thud echoed like an executioner's gavel. Without sparing Victor a single glance, she turned her icy blue eyes to the board, radiating an absolute, quiet authority she had not possessed the day before. Eleanor flipped the cover of the red leather folder open. The slow, deliberate movement commanded the absolute, breathless attention of the entire room. With clinical precision, she slid the first piece of evidence, a highlighted offshore bank statement, across the polished glass toward the lead director. Victor broke the silence, his voice cracking as he desperately attempted to dismiss the glaring financial anomalies as a complex misunderstanding. Eleanor did not raise her voice. She simply delivered a single, devastatingly calm command for him to sit down, channeling the unyielding authority of the mountain. Right on cue, Hannah stepped into the boardroom, flanked by 2 armed corporate security officers. The once timid assistant now stood with rigid, unapologetic confidence. As the forged invoices circulated down the table, the board members' expressions morphed rapidly from feigned concern into genuine, visceral disgust. Victor's gaze darted around the glass walls, searching for an ally. Finding none, he sank heavily into his leather chair, utterly dismantled. The lead director cleared his throat, immediately voiding the previous motion and calling for a swift, unanimous vote for termination and federal prosecution. Hands raised in quick succession around the long table. The corporate execution was entirely bloodless, conducted in the harsh, sterile light of the tower. As security escorted the disgraced executive away, Eleanor turned her back to the room. She slipped her mud-stained hands into the deep pockets of the faded field jacket. In the days that followed, the corporate fallout was swift and absolute. Eleanor reclaimed her pristine office, the sterile environment perfectly re-established. Yet, resting on her imported leather sofa was the faded military field jacket. It remained a glaring, physical anchor to a reality far beyond the glass walls. Leaving a barrage of congratulatory calls unanswered, she lifted the heavy canvas fabric and walked out of the tower. The winding mountain road, previously a lethal trap of deep water, was now bathed in the golden, forgiving light of a late autumn afternoon. Eleanor navigated a borrowed, sensible SUV toward a hidden gravel driveway. At the end of the path stood a small, weathered cedar house nestled among the pines. The rusted defender sat quietly near an open wooden garage, where the rhythmic clinking of heavy tools echoed through the quiet forest. On the front porch, Lily sat with a sketchbook. The child's serious gray eyes lifted from the paper as the vehicle tires crunched against the gravel. Eleanor stepped out into the crisp mountain air. She was dressed elegantly, but the arrogant armor of the executive was visibly absent. The young girl did not retreat or alert her father. She simply closed her book, evaluating the visitor with the quiet intuition of someone much older. Hearing the engine, Arthur slid out from beneath a massive vehicle chassis. He sat up, wiping dark grease from his hands with a slow, deliberate motion. Eleanor walked up the gravel driveway. The stark contrast between her pristine white tailoring and his grease-stained workwear highlighted the immense distance between their worlds. Stopping a few feet from the garage, she held out the neatly folded field jacket. It was an offering of respect, entirely devoid of her former arrogance. Arthur accepted the heavy canvas. He offered no polite smile, but his steady gaze registered the profound, quiet transformation in the executive. Rather than retreating to her vehicle, Eleanor withdrew a thick, sealed legal envelope from her leather bag. She presented the document. It was a binding pledge. Vance Global would fully fund and outfit a new fleet of heavy-duty response vehicles for his volunteer unit. Arthur broke the seal, his oil-stained fingers leaving dark fingerprints on the pristine corporate parchment as he scanned the legal terms. His expression hardened immediately. With blunt military directness, he stated that his rescue team would not serve as a public relations stunt for her boardroom. Eleanor met his challenging stare without flinching. She clarified in a low, even voice that the endowment was entirely anonymous, legally barring any corporate publicity. The former commander studied her face, actively searching for the familiar deceit of the elite. Finding absolute sincerity, the rigid tension in his shoulders slowly dissolved. From the elevated porch, Lily observed the silent negotiation. With a nearly imperceptible nod of approval, the child picked up her pencil and resumed sketching. Arthur folded the heavily funded pledge and slid it into his back pocket. The dark grease immediately stained the pristine white envelope. With a gruff exhale, he offered the executive a cup of black coffee, noting bluntly that his kitchen possessed none of the city's luxuries. The billionaire CEO, accustomed to exclusively tailored experiences, accepted the offer without a fraction of hesitation. They relocated to the weathered wooden steps of the front porch, sharing a space that was entirely devoid of corporate pretense. Arthur emerged from the house carrying two chipped, mismatched ceramic mugs. Steam rose from the dark, bitter liquid within. Eleanor took a slow sip. Despite the harsh, unrefined taste, her expression remained calm, accepting the warmth with quiet grace. Without warning, Lily turned and held up her sketchbook. Spread across the page was a crude but distinct drawing of a heavy truck rescuing a tiny car from a swirling flood. Eleanor studied the child's artwork. Slowly, a genuine, unguarded smile broke across her face, the first authentic expression she had shown in days. Arthur observed the subtle transformation from the corner of his eye. The genuine warmth stripped away the final remnants of the untouchable corporate monarch. The three figures sat together on the cedar steps. A comfortable, profound silence settled over the porch as the late afternoon sun cast long, amber shadows across the yard. 4 weeks passed. As the harsh mountain winter began its descent, a dusting of white snow settled over the sturdy cedar house. Inside the warm kitchen, the immaculate executive had traded her tailored silk for a thick, sensible wool sweater. Standing on a wooden stool, Lily seriously instructed the CEO on the highly specific, traditional method of slicing a pan of fresh cornbread. Eleanor gave the child's lesson the exact same intense, unbroken focus she once reserved for high-stakes corporate acquisitions. Leaning against the wooden doorframe, Arthur watched the two of them. A quiet, undeniable warmth had permanently settled into his features. During their routine Wednesday dinners, the layers of Arthur's guarded history slowly unraveled across the rustic kitchen table. He showed her a faded photograph of a Coast Guard helicopter crew, his weathered finger tracing over a call sign that read Annabelle. Eleanor listened in profound, respectful silence as he recounted the devastating hurricane response that ultimately forced him into the mountains. She finally understood the quiet grief that drove him to build heavy rescue machines in absolute, uncredited isolation. Back in the city, Eleanor weaponized her corporate power for a new purpose, signing documents to funnel millions into rural disaster preparedness. One quiet evening in mid-December, Eleanor and Arthur sat in a low-lit, roadside diner on the edge of town, the heavy snowfall isolating them in a bubble of warm neon. The bell above the glass door chimed. A tall man in a plain overcoat entered, possessing the unmistakable, rigid bearing of someone who had spent 2 decades in uniform. The stranger crossed the checkered floor and stopped directly at their booth. He placed a simple, embossed white business card onto the laminate table. He introduced himself as a director for the new Federal Mobile Response Program, offering Arthur a senior consulting position that demanded constant travel to Washington. The official departed into the snowy night, leaving the card sitting like a heavy anchor between the executive and the mechanic. Arthur stared at the embossed seal. The silent implication was massive. It meant leaving the quiet sanctuary of the mountains, and leaving the fragile connection they were building. Later, in the freezing parking lot beside the idling Defender, Arthur finally voiced the reality of the offer. The travel would be extensive and demanding. Eleanor met his gaze through the falling snow. She did not express disappointment or ask him to stay in the quiet cedar house. With absolute, unwavering sincerity, she told him to accept the position, refusing to let her own comfort keep a man of his vast capability tied to a small town. Arthur looked at her longer than usual, the deep respect in his eyes replacing the need for words, before he simply opened the heavy passenger door to take her home. 2 days later, Arthur formally accepted the federal commission. The cedar house prepared for a new rhythm of absence and duty. His heavy canvas duffel bag sat by the front door. Lily, accustomed to the quiet realities of his service, simply focused on feeding the stubborn barn cat. It was a cold Sunday afternoon. The low, yellow winter sun cast long shadows across the frost-covered gravel driveway. Eleanor sat quietly on the porch steps, her tailored coat unbuttoned against the crisp air, watching Arthur close the heavy hood of the Defender. Wiping his hands on a shop rag, he walked over and sat down beside her, maintaining the familiar, respectful distance between them. He held out his hand, palm open. Resting in the center was a dark metal challenge coin, worn incredibly smooth at the edges. He stated quietly that his old Coast Guard crew only gave these to people they trusted implicitly in the field. He hadn't given one away in 8 years. Eleanor took the cold metal in both hands. She did not immediately turn it over, simply letting the immense weight of the gesture settle into her palms. Lily wandered over, dragging the barn cat in her arms. Without looking up, the child sat down and leaned her head against her father's shoulder. Then, the young girl reached out her small free hand and rested it naturally on Eleanor's wrist. It was an absolute, silent integration into their world. The harsh winter eventually yielded to the morning of Arthur's departure. The packed canvas duffel bag was loaded into the back of the Defender. On the frost-covered porch, he knelt and pulled Lily into a tight, lingering embrace, anchoring her against his impending absence. Standing nearby, Eleanor offered no dramatic farewells. A silent, unwavering look of mutual respect sealed the space between them. The heavy engine roared to life. The rugged vehicle disappeared down the mountain road, leaving the executive and the child in the quiet forest. Months turned. The biting frost melted into a vibrant mountain spring, bringing a new, unexpected routine to Eleanor's life. True to the unspoken agreement, the pristine white SUV appeared outside the rural elementary school every Wednesday afternoon. The formidable CEO walked the dirt paths, effortlessly carrying a brightly colored child's backpack alongside the quiet, observant young girl. In the towering corporate suites, Eleanor wielded her power with renewed, lethal precision, driving the Disaster Foundation forward against all resistance. During the most hostile negotiations, her manicured fingers would quietly trace the smooth edge of the dark metal coin hidden in her pocket. The vast distance was bridged by glowing laptop screens in the Cedar House, where Arthur's digital presence maintained the fragile, enduring bond. As the vibrant spring transitioned into the heavy warmth of early summer, the Cedar House awaited its absent guardian. A dark, government-issued vehicle crunched along the familiar gravel path, bringing the extended federal deployment to an end. Arthur stepped onto the driveway. The heavy canvas duffel bag slung over his shoulder carried the invisible weight of months spent in disaster zones. From the wooden porch, Lily dropped a handful of cat toys. The young girl froze, her gray eyes wide with sudden, overwhelming recognition. She sprinted across the yard, colliding with her father in a desperate, silent embrace that shattered his stoic military composure. Minutes later, the pristine white SUV pulled into the clearing, parking beside the rugged federal transport. Eleanor stepped out. The formidable executive who commanded boardrooms was entirely absent, replaced by a woman anchored to this remote sanctuary. Arthur stood up, his gaze locking onto hers. The thousands of miles between Washington and the mountain town evaporated in an instant. They did not exchange grand declarations. Eleanor closed the remaining distance, stepping into his arms in a quiet, profoundly grounding reunion. Under the dappled shade of the ancient pines, the mechanic, the executive, and the child stood united, their fractured worlds finally whole. The summer brought a permanent shift to the mountain town. The Cedar House expanded, seamlessly integrating the executive's refined taste with the mechanic's rustic foundation. Down in the valley, the Vance Foundation unveiled its first operational headquarters. A massive, state-of-the-art facility built from Eleanor's reclaimed corporate wealth. Arthur walked the polished concrete floor of the new garage, inspecting a pristine line of heavy-duty, heavily armored response vehicles. He wore a dark canvas jacket bearing a new insignia, a subtle fusion of his old Coast Guard call sign and the Foundation's corporate emblem. Eleanor stood on the elevated steel walkway above the garage, watching him command the new volunteer crews with effortless, absolute authority. She held a ceramic coffee mug, resting her hands on the cold steel railing. The icy CEO had been entirely replaced by a grounded, formidable patron. Below, Lily darted between the massive tires of the new fleet, confidently carrying a clipboard as if she were the chief inspector. A veteran volunteer handed Arthur a heavy clipboard, waiting for the final operational sign-off. Arthur signed it with a grease-stained pen. He looked up toward the walkway, meeting Eleanor's gaze. The vast, unbridgeable chasm that once separated their worlds no longer existed. The massive bay doors of the facility rolled open simultaneously, letting the bright, piercing summer sun flood the pristine concrete floor. Late that autumn, another massive storm system swept through the valley. But this time, the mountain was no longer shrouded in helpless panic. Inside the Foundation headquarters, the emergency systems chimed with a quiet, coherent rhythm. Everything operated with absolute, engineered precision. Arthur donned his heavy tactical gear. He was no longer a solitary survivor, but the resolute commander of an elite frontline unit. From the elevated glass command center, Eleanor monitored the glowing weather radar. Her corporate power now protected lives, rather than profit margins. Standing before the armored fleet, Arthur issued brief, decisive orders to his volunteer crew. The instructions were received with unwavering respect. In a secure corner of the facility, Lily calmly sketched new drawings, entirely unfazed by the flashing amber alerts outside her room. The massive steel bay doors ascended, welcoming the freezing winds and heavy, relentless rain from the approaching tempest. The fleet of heavy rescue vehicles rolled into the dark. Their intense yellow headlights tore through the shadows, an unstoppable force against nature. Eleanor watched the fading red taillights from the glass overlooking the valley. Her gaze held no manipulative calculation, only deep, quiet pride. Gripping the heavy steering wheel of the lead vehicle, Arthur allowed a faint smile. He drove into the storm, anchored by a family that was finally complete. By dawn, the heavy storm had broken. The armored fleet returned to the valley headquarters, their steel hulls caked in mud but entirely victorious. Arthur stepped down from the lead transport. Exhaustion lined his face, but the ghosts of his past had finally been laid to rest. Eleanor stood waiting on the polished concrete. She handed him a steaming ceramic mug, perfectly reversing the roles of their first quiet morning. The Foundation quickly became the gold standard for disaster response across the region, a testament to what immense wealth could achieve when guided by purpose. Far away in the city, Victor Thorne faced the absolute reality of federal prosecution. His carefully constructed empire of deceit had completely crumbled. Back on the mountain, the rhythm of life settled into a profound, unbreakable harmony. The corporate tower no longer dictated Eleanor's existence. On a warm weekend afternoon, Lily sat at the kitchen table, her vibrant sketches now serving as blueprints for her father's next rescue machine. Arthur worked in the open garage, the heavy rhythm of his tools echoing through the ancient pines like a steady, comforting heartbeat. Eleanor watched them from the wooden porch, her beautifully manicured hand resting gently against the rough cedar railing.